This is The Backstory with Omobola Stephen. It's a balanced, objective, unbiased and disruptive conversation on government and politics. We shine more light on what has not worked and what would make it work. And now, to the finest, personable and engaging host extraordinaire, Omobola Stephen. Tune in.
Thanks for tuning into our podcast. We love having you here, and it's our mission to bring you all the latest and greatest tips, skills, and know-how to make you the best that you can be. We know that you have it in you, and we're going to show you how. Now, let's get started.
Good to have you once again on the Backstory with Omobola Stephen. On the Backstory, we shine more light on what has not worked and what will make it work, focusing on government and politics and other subtopics like society and culture, the environment and exercise and technology. We like to talk about disruptive mindset conversations that's going to pivot change and transformation that the world needs in general. Today, I have Richard Villasana, who is the author of the book, Do You Know Him, and also the founder for Forever Living Homes for Foster Kids on the Backstory today. Welcome, Richard Villasana.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. We will be talking about the discrimination of Latino children in the U.S. foster care. And now it's good to know that we are in this the National Hispanic Heritage Month, which starts on the 15th of September to October 15th. And so I would like you to shed more light on this important celebration. Let's look at the facts about the U.S. Latinos.
So thank you, number one, for acknowledging that today, this is an international holiday, Hispanic Heritage Month. This is celebrated for not only heritage, but this is also a time between September 15th and October 15th when Latin American countries that were Spanish are now on their own, celebrate their independence. So this is a very huge Independence Day for a lot of these countries in Central and South America. And so it's not just a U.S. holiday, although we do have at now getting close to 60 million Latinos. We have one of the largest groupings of Latinos and Hispanics in the world. And so this is a time of celebration. It's a time of family. Unfortunately, it's also a time of sadness because there are thousands and thousands of Hispanic, what we call Latino children in the U.S., and they are in what we call the foster care system. And for someone who may not be aware of that, let me just explain what the foster care system is. It's a system where if a child is in danger or under serious neglect, they're being starved, they're in a place that is dangerous for the child to live. It is we're talking about very poor conditions. Then they are pulled away from their parents by the government to protect those children and are placed in foster care. I know most of the countries in the world have an orphanage system. Ours is a little different. There are about 8 countries that have this foster care system. And we bring them and put them there for their safety. And over the next few months, maybe longer, these agencies do try to arrange for the child to go back to the parent if the situation was not deadly or very violent for the child. And half of the kids that come out do go back into with their family. And just to give an idea, we're always talking about 400,000+ children at one time that are outside of the home and are in the foster care system. And once they're in the foster care system, then the next step, and if they can't be reunited with their parents, the next step is to find relatives who will take them in, because again, we're talking about family. And most children prefer to be with family, an aunt, an uncle. I had a favorite aunt, and if someone, for some reason I'd been taken and someone said, "Would you like to be with your Aunt Diane?" I've been like, absolutely. So this is the way it is for kids. There's always a relative that they would like to be with or they've heard about. And even if they've never met that person, I've had children who said, I would gladly have lived with my aunt who is 3-4 states away from where I am. I don't know her, but she's family. There's always that feeling that because we're family, we're going to get treated better or be treated justly, and that we're going to be safe with family. And while that doesn't always turn out to be true, it is true for the vast majority of situations where a child is able to be placed with a relative, and that relative takes over, and oftentimes a relative may actually adopt the child because the parent just simply is in a place where they cannot function, they cannot care for a child, or they're just violent and bad people who had a child but are not good parents. And so we're always looking for the best outcome for foster kids and for the children in general so that they can have a good, loving, stable life.
All right. Now let's talk about Latino's children's health in the United States. What are the top on the list?
Could you say it one more time? I'm sorry.
I'd like to talk about the Latino's children's health in the U.S. So I'd like you to talk about the issues that are top on the list.
So the challenges for Latino children, the biggest one is discrimination. And here's what I mean by discrimination. When a child comes into foster care and we can't place them with a relative, there's not a relative in the city or someone who can drive in to take the child like an aunt or a grandparent, then they go formally into the foster care system. And at that point, agencies are required by law to start looking for other relatives. And there's a process called family finding. And it's very simple and it's very powerful. It's a 3-step process. Number one, we make a list of all the relatives, and hopefully it's a long list of relatives. And then number two, we get the contact information for all of those relatives. And number three, and this is very important, we notify them. We let them know, you have a child relative who is in foster care. And once they're notified, if we have a big enough list, the idea is that someone will step up and say, I'll take them. I'll take little Maria or little Marco, and I will bring them into my family and take care of them. As I said, it's a simple 3-step process, but it's powerful because it gets the child out of the system. Because our foster care system is not one that is made for children to be there long term. Just because this is the U.S. doesn't mean that kids are not in situations that are not best, not stable. They can actually be in situations in foster care that are very violent. So as much as we try to protect the kids, just because they're in foster care does not ensure that every child is being loved and cared for properly. That's just the way it is. Because the foster care system is made up of people. And we all know there are people who don't do as well as others, don't give as much as others, and some of those adults actually take. And that happens also in the foster care system. So hopefully by doing this family finding, we will have found a relative that we can place the child with, and the child can now go stay with her aunt, an older cousin, a grandparent, a godparent. I know that happened. We found a godparent. And in this particular case, the child who was in their early teens, 13, went to go live with the godparent, and the godparent adopted him. That's amazing. And that's the power of family finding. Finding a relative who takes a child in and basically says, you're mine. Mine in the sense of, I will love you, I will care for you, I will treat you as my own. And that's amazing. Because even though we have people who want to adopt and people who want to care for these children, and those are wonderful people, we know from studies that children do better when they're with family. So if we can get a child with a family member And if they can't return to their parents, they're able to stay and live with that relative. They will do better emotionally, mentally, at school, and in life. All of those areas, they'll do better than if they were strangers. Fortunately, it's just the way the reports and the studies have shown this to be true.
Now, Richard, is racism not a lack of assimilation? Is it the real problem that is facing the Latino children in the U.S.?
So it's not a question of assimilation. Everyone, though, who comes from another country, another culture, has that culture with them. Now, when it comes to Latinos, for many of them, it's a way of life. So I'll give a personal example. So when I met my wife, I was in my early 30s, and we started dating, and we would go to church, and she would go with her mother and her brothers and their wives and their kids, and we would fill up 2 rows of seats in the church. And I'm looking around and thinking, this feels familiar to me. And then we would go afterwards with all the family to someone's home, and we would have a cooking and what they call a carne asada. And we would have this carne asada, this word in Spanish for this get together. And we would spend 3, 4, 6, 7 hours together. And I'm looking around and thinking, this feels familiar. And even though my last name is Villasana, I didn't grow up with someone saying, "You're Hispanic." I never got that message. I never had that kind of interaction at school where someone said, "You're Hispanic." I was just Richard. So I never had anyone push my culture on me. I never had to answer for my culture. I just knew I was Richard, and I'm going to school, and I'm doing everything everyone else does. And now I'm with my wife, and we're having this carne asada, and we're going to church every Sunday. And I'm calling my friends up and saying, "Hey, Mike, did you guys go to church with all of your family members?" "No, man." "Did you all get together after church and spend hours together with your family?" "No, man." And that was exactly what I did when I was growing up. But no one said, "Oh, you've got your grandmothers here, you've got your aunts and uncles and your cousins here at church. You must be Hispanic." Nobody said that. So I never knew until I started dating my wife about this side of my life. So we can't separate who we are in our culture. It can be there whether we know it overtly or whether, like me, I realized, oh, I grew up Hispanic. I never knew until I was in my 30s. So number one, when we have this, we can't take these away from the child. And that is what happens when a child who's Latino comes into foster care. They're placed with non-Latinos. So they don't understand about food. Food is huge for people's culture. Family is huge. So now they're separated from their families. They're not going to church. They're not seeing their grandparents. They're not seeing that family unit that I just described every Sunday, or for birthdays, or for holidays. All of that is gone. And they're now with people who just don't get those nuances of their culture. Then what happens on top of that is that they have people who are working with them. They're caseworkers who may not understand anything about the culture. And what really gets bad is, let's go back to the family finding that I mentioned a moment ago. So what happens here is, when you're trying to look for a child and you're making that list and you're trying to find contact information for a relative, what are things that you look for? You're looking for birth certificates. You're looking for city and state information. Well, if you have someone who's a Latino child, they may have relatives living in, because of the United States and its proximity, Mexico. if it's not Mexico, maybe now Central America, because we have a huge influx of children and families from Central America coming into the U.S. It used to be almost predominantly Mexico. Now Guatemala is one of the, if not the leading country, the next leading country where people are coming up from. And in that country, we have people who are indigenous, who do not speak Spanish. They speak other languages like Mam, Acateco, Quiche. And we have an organization, this foster care system across the U.S., we barely handle Spanish. Now we have these people coming in with their culture from Central America, their indigenous culture, and their language. And we are seeing massive discrimination because they are required to take these steps, make that list, contact these parents, and they're not doing it because they don't know what to do. They're not trained. They don't have the resources. But where the discrimination comes in, I could forgive that. But what I can't forgive is they're not getting the training. They're not bringing in the experts who know how to deal with this. They're not trying to reach out to all of those relatives. Instead, they're not reaching out to any of the relatives. And what they'll say is, well, I called a phone number 2-3 times and I got a busy signal. I guess we're good. I guess that's it for the child. I did my best. 3 phone calls and that's your best. I called and I got voicemail, but I didn't leave a voicemail message. That's your best. Even if you left a voicemail, does that count as their best? No, it does not. So because of who they are, because of where their relatives are from, because it's in another language, these agencies are not going through the process. Or, and this is almost worse, they'll make the list, they'll get the contact information, and then they won't send out the notification. Can I share a quick story with you? One of my colleagues was sitting with a nonprofit here in San Diego, and that nonprofit is given money to do family finding. So they're getting money for every child to do this activity. It's in their contract. And my colleague was in the room in a meeting with this director, and someone came in and said, "Excuse me for a moment. I'm ready to send out notices for this child's family." And the director said, "Well, stop. We're not going to send notices to every family member because that's going to cost time and money. Just send one notice to one relative." That's not how family finding works. The idea was you have lots of relatives, someone steps up. You have one relative, the answer could be, "I'm not interested." And yet they could have aunts, uncles, cousins, other relatives who would gladly take them in if they were notified. And that's not happening. It is a violation of law. It is a violation, a discrimination because of their country of origin, because of their heritage, because of their ethnicity. These children are discriminated against because of that. In this country, instead of looking at the bottom line, we need to do what is absolutely best for this child.
All right, now, so why are Latinos so overrepresented, right, in the states? Let me put it back again. Why are the Latinos so overrepresented in the state's child welfare system?
Well, to be fair, it's pretty much close to, there are some reports will say that they're overrepresented, but it's pretty close. The problem is not necessarily the representation, it's the results and the action that they receive. So that discrimination is impacting these children. That's where the problem's coming in. we're pretty much on balance. There's about 1 out of 5 children, families, people in the U.S. are Latino. About 1 out of 5 children in foster care are Latino. So those numbers, and again, sometimes there's bad information out there where people will share larger numbers, but I can tell you as an expert, it's much closer, but they are disproportionately discriminated against because of this language barrier, this culture, and a sense in the U.S. that these are inferior people, whether they were born in the U.S. or not, doesn't matter. And this goes back to the racism, the color of their skin, how they look. And now, oh, you're Latino, so now you've got another strike against you as a child. And, oh, and your information is in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. All right. I'm just not going to do anything with this. I will put you in a family I think that you'll be good for, not this is a family that would be good for you. And that's where this gets so tilted against the Latino kids, because we have 60 million people in this country. And there was a government official in the state of Illinois, which is the northern part of the United States, and she wrote, and this is in my book, Do No Harm, where she says, we're talking about Spanish. I could understand if we were talking about Mandarin, but there is no excuse not to have people on board working in agencies who speak Spanish. And they're right. It's not like they all just showed up last year. It's not like this is a new language we need to understand. Latinos have been here before we got here. And yet the government, with all of its laws saying you will provide information in the language of choice, you will do these things, you are getting paid federal dollars to do these activities, and yet these counties are happy to take the money but not produce the work. They're happy to take the resources from the federal and state governments but not look at caring for the children. And that is where the disproportionate activity is happening, is that these kids are being put on the sideline, and at the most extreme levels. When I say extreme, what I'm talking about, they won't look for a father. See, our laws here, we assume that you're going to look for the father or mother. That's pretty much an assumption. We have laws that say you'll look for grandma and aunts and uncles, because we assume, because it says, if you take the child to the doctor, you will notify the parents. If you take the child to the dentist, you will notify the parents. If you move the child, etc., you will notify the parents. By law, we assume that we're going to be in touch with the parents, and yet these agencies, and I have personally been on a phone call with someone at an agency who said, we're not going to move forward at this time to find this child's father.
Thank you so much, Villasana. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. You emphasize discrimination from the Latino children in the U.S. Now, talking about Latinos in the U.S., they also face discrimination for fellow Latinos and also non-Latinos at nearly the same rate. Is this valid?
So, yes, in foster care, there is discrimination, because being in foster care carries a stigma with it, that these children are troublemakers, that they're not good kids, that they cause the problem. And unfortunately, that thinking impacts these children, because they hear about this. They get treated differently in school. They get treated differently by students, by teachers. I'll share a quick story here. So, one former foster child wrote me. He said, I had been placed with this woman. A week before school, she takes me and my foster brother. This was simply another boy, but he considered him a foster brother there in the home. So the woman drives these two kids to school. It's not on right now. The school is closed, but she made an appointment to drive to school to have them sit in front of the principal. And the principal said, I know who you are. If there's any trouble in school, I'll be looking for you two first, because I will figure out that you caused this problem. So you better watch yourself. These kids had done nothing, and yet their foster mom thought it was a good idea to take them and to put them in front of this person who abused them verbally and emotionally by telling them, I'm going to be watching you. Now, do you think those children had a wonderful time in school after that? No. Did they trust their foster mother after that? No. This woman completely destroyed any sense of trust and stability and sense of love by doing something that was horrible to these kids. So yes, when kids are in foster care, they get discrimination of varying ways. They get bullied. They get abused. They get abused in the home by some of these foster parents. They get abused by the kids of the foster parents. There was a story, and the one child said, yes, I would break things and I would blame the foster child. And it was funny watching my mom punish this foster kid because I didn't like the kid. So the mom was trying to do something good and respectful, and her son was resentful for that. And so he caused trouble for the foster child. Or they had their toys taken away. The one thing they got from their mother, the one thing that reminds them of their mother. And these people have no problem taking that away from the child. So there's emotional abuse, there's physical abuse, mental abuse. These are discriminations that all foster children suffer. Does not matter whether they're Latino or otherwise. And that is a huge problem we have, which again goes back to why family finding is so important, because if we could get the children out of the system and back with relatives, we can save them from being in that situation sometime, because foster kids in general move twice a year. Imagine that. For 6 months, you're in your home. Looks like a lovely home. And so it says, okay, it's time to move. You got to pack everything up. You're moving again. And 6 months later, you're somewhere. You're comfortable. Everything is where you want it to be. Omobola, it's time to move again. And this happens year after year after year. Some kids have been not just moved, some kids have been in 20 different schools. Think about it, 20 schools over their lifetime as they've been in foster care.
Right. Thanks for sharing your thoughts once again, and Richard. And we would like to learn more about Forever Living Homes and also about your book, Do You Know Her? Can you provide your website and your social media handles?
Absolutely. So for people to learn more about the organization, we're at Forever Homes for, and that's FOR, fosterkids.org. And people can go there and can see about what we do. Let me share a quick story. This is how family finding works. We had 3 little girls, 4, 8, and 10, and they went into foster care. And they knew they had 2 aunts living in Chicago, but they didn't know enough to tell the caseworker the phone number or an address or even their last name. So the agency did try. This was a good agency. They tried, but they said, we just don't have enough information. They did have information on some relatives that lived in Mexico. So they came to my nonprofit and they said, look, we have some information on relatives in Mexico. Can you find them for us? Sure. In less than 3 weeks, we had information so they could pick the phone up and make a phone call. So on a Saturday, the caseworker had an interpreter to speak Spanish. That was good thinking. She calls to Mexico and she gets one of the uncles. And she's talking to the uncle. And during the conversation, she says, do you know anything about 2 aunts living in Chicago? And he says, wait a minute. A moment goes by, and then a woman gets on the phone, and the caseworker introduces herself, tells her why she's calling, and says, "Do you know anything about these aunts living in Chicago?" She says, "Of course I do. I'm one of them." The two aunts were sitting in the living room having coffee with the family. They had flown from Chicago, and they were there for a week, and they were there when the phone call came in, and were able to talk to the caseworker right then and there. The caseworker went crazy. She's like, "Oh my God, I've never had anything like this happen in 17 years of working as a caseworker." Guess where the girls are? They're with their two aunts. The aunt said, "Absolutely, we're going to take the girls." The girls are now living with their aunts in Chicago. They're back in school. They're with loving family members. That's family finding. That's the power to change being alone. And they could have been separated. That happens a lot to siblings. They get separated and never see each other, or it could be decades before they see each other. And we were able to keep 3 little girls together and had them live with family members. That's the power of family finding. And that's what we do. And that's the good side of foster care, where there are people who are working, like my nonprofit, to make that happen and to give these kids the life and an opportunity at a better, brighter future. And the book, Do No Harm, talks about the foster care system, has wonderful stories about children who have been reunited with their relatives. It does talk about the many immigrant children who have come across and who have ended up being placed in foster care. And that's a whole nother topic, but it talks about that and about their journey from Latin America to the U.S. and into the U.S. foster care system. But once they're there in foster care, family finding kicks in. And if done properly, and it is being done right in some parts of the country, just not enough. It's just an area where we need more education, more resources, and more people taking it seriously and doing it for children, whether their relatives live in the U.S. or outside the U.S. Every child deserves to have that work done to reunite them with a family member. And that's what the book talks about, because it highlights all the wonderful people who are working hard to make this a better life and a better world for these kids.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that information to us, Richard. I wish you best of luck in the projects that you embark upon.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Me on the show. Thanks for joining me on the show once again, for sharing your thoughts on the discrimination of Latino children in the U.S. foster care. Now, if you'd like to catch up with any missed episodes of the Backstory with Omobola Stephen, you can do so on any podcast distribution platforms or cross-promotion platforms that you bump into online. And do you have a great time listening to experts share their thoughts on topics or subjects on the government and politics? Till I come your way, I need you to stay safe. I talk soon.